Hello and welcome. Find a comfortable space, a quiet corner in the late hours of the evening, and allow the clamor of the modern world to dissolve. Tonight, we are not venturing into the shadowy corridors of royal palaces or the blood-soaked trenches of a global cataclysm. Our story does not feature spies and assassins, nor does it concern the rise and fall of empires in the traditional sense. Instead, we are journeying to a land of immense, sun-drenched horizons and endless skies of piercing blue. Our destination is the Western Australian wheat belt, and our year is 1932. We are going to tell the story of a war. It was a war formally sanctioned by a national government, commanded by a decorated military officer, fought by professional soldiers, and waged with the modern, efficient instruments of death that had been perfected in the crucible of the Great War. It had a declared enemy, a clear objective, and a designated theater of operations. But this was a conflict so strange, so utterly bizarre, that it has been relegated to the footnotes of military history, a story told more often with a chuckle than with solemn reverence. This is because the enemy, the tenacious, wily, and surprisingly effective adversary that faced the Commonwealth of Australia, was not a human army. It was not a political insurgency. The enemy was a bird. This is the exhaustive, true, and deeply absurd story of the Great Emu War. It is a chronicle that sounds, in its retelling, like a tall tale spun from the heat-addled imagination of an outback storyteller, yet every surreal detail is meticulously documented in parliamentary debates, military reports, and the newspaper archives of the day. It is a saga of desperate men, a beleaguered government, and a flock of flightless feathered nomads who confounded, outmaneuvered, and ultimately humiliated the armed forces of a proud nation. On the surface, it is perhaps the most comical military campaign ever waged. But if we dig deeper, beneath the layers of absurdity, we find a far more poignant and revealing story. It's a story about the harsh realities of life on the frontier, the profound desperation of the Great Depression, the unintended consequences of human expansion, and the eternal, often humbling collision between our own best-laid plans and the indomitable, unpredictable forces of the natural world. So let us travel back to that fateful year of 1932, to a vast and lonely landscape on the far edge of a continent, where the wheat fields that were meant to be a promised land became a battlefield, and where the Australian military learned a hard and valuable lesson: never, ever underestimate an emu. Part 1. A land not fit for heroes, the seeds of conflict. To comprehend how a modern industrialized nation could find itself deploying machine guns against its own national fauna, we must first peel back the calendar to the years following the end of the First World War. The so-called War to End All Wars had concluded in 1918, but it had left a deep and traumatic scar on the young nation of Australia. From a population of fewer than 5 million people, over 400,000 had enlisted to fight for king and country. More than 60,000 of them never came home. Those who did return were profoundly changed, men haunted by the memories of Gallipoli shores and the muddy, blood-soaked fields of the Western Front. The Australian government and the wider British Empire felt a deep sense of obligation to these returning soldiers, the diggers. Politicians made stirring speeches promising to build a land fit for heroes. One of the most tangible expressions of this promise was the soldier settlement scheme. The concept was simple and noble. The government would acquire vast tracts of land, divide it into individual farmsteads, and offer it to returned servicemen on favorable terms, often with low-interest loans for equipment and seed. It was a chance for these men to build a new life, to find peace and prosperity through honest hard work on their own piece of Australia. Nowhere was this scheme pursued with more vigor than in the vast, sparsely populated state of Western Australia. The government opened up huge swathes of land in what would become known as the wheat belt, east of the city of Perth. This was marginal country, on the edge of the Great Australian Desert. It was land covered in tough, resilient bush, primarily mallee and scrub. It was not a gentle, pastoral landscape, It was harsh, unforgiving, and for agriculture profoundly challenging. Over 5,000 veterans and their families took up the offer in Western Australia. These were not, for the most part, experienced farmers. They were former infantrymen, artillerymen, and light horsemen. They knew how to dig a trench, clean a rifle, and endure hardship, but few knew the complex art of cultivating wheat in a semi-arid environment. They were given a block of land, a tent, and a set of tools, and were faced with the Herculean task of clearing the native vegetation by hand, a back-breaking process of felling trees and pulling stumps under a relentless sun. They were pioneers in the truest sense of the word. For a brief period in the 1920s, it seemed the dream might just work. High global prices for wheat and a series of unusually wet seasons allowed many of these soldier settlers to establish their farms and begin turning a profit. Small communities with names like Campion and Walgulin sprang up in the wilderness. But the good times were a fragile illusion. Then came the crash. In October 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed, triggering the Great Depression. The economic shockwave radiated across the globe with terrifying speed. For Australia, whose economy was deeply dependent on the export of primary products like wool and wheat, the effect was catastrophic. The international market for these commodities evaporated. The price of wheat, the very commodity upon which the soldier settlers had staked their entire future, plummeted. By 1932, the situation was dire. A farmer could labor for an entire year, battling drought and poor soil, and produce a bumper crop, only to find that the price he received for it was less than the cost of the seed and the fuel he had used to harvest it. The government loans they had taken out to establish their farms were now an anchor, dragging them down into bankruptcy. These men, who had survived the hell of industrial warfare, were now facing a new, more insidious enemy: economic ruin. They were watching their dreams, and the promises of a grateful nation, turn to dust before their very eyes. The land fit for heroes was becoming a landscape of despair. It was into this crucible of human struggle and desperation that a new protagonist, a non-human one, was about to march. Part 2. The adversary Dromaeus Nova Hollandi. To understand the war, you must first understand the warrior. Let us take a moment to profile the enemy. Dromaeus Nova Hollandi. The emu. The emu is a creature of ancient lineage, a member of the ratite family of flightless birds that includes the ostrich, the cassowary, and the kiwi. They are remnants of the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana. Standing up to 1.9 meters or 6 feet 2 inches tall, the emu is the largest bird native to Australia and the second largest in the world. An adult can weigh between 30 and 55 kilograms, 66 to 121 pounds. Its appearance is unique, almost prehistoric. It is covered not in smooth, contoured feathers, but in a thick, shaggy, double-plumed coat of grayish-brown plumage that gives it a perpetually unkempt look. This plumage is surprisingly effective as a form of insulation against the extremes of the Australian climate, and, as the Army would soon discover, it also served as a surprisingly effective, if unintentional, form of natural body armor. Though flightless, the emu is a master of locomotion. Its long, powerful three-toed legs are built for speed and endurance. It can maintain a steady trot for long distances and, when threatened, can burst into a sprint of up to 50 kilometers per hour, or 30 miles per hour. It does not run in a predictable straight line. It employs a seemingly chaotic, zigzagging gait, making it an incredibly difficult target for any predator or any machine gunner. The emu's life is governed by the ancient rhythms of the Australian seasons. They are nomadic, their movements dictated by the search for food and water. For millennia, they followed a well-established migratory pattern. During the breeding season, they would congregate in the more fertile inland areas of Australia. After breeding, as the interior began to dry out in the heat of early summer, they would begin a slow, steady migration towards the coastal regions, seeking greener pastures. And in 1932, something miraculous happened from the emu's perspective. As they began their annual post-breeding trek westwards, they emerged from the harsh, arid interior and stumbled upon a landscape that must have seemed like a bird's vision of paradise. As far as the eye could see, stretching for hundreds of miles, were vast, cultivated fields of young, tender green wheat. It was an endless all-you-can-eat buffet. And to make matters even better, the farmers had, for their own livestock, constructed numerous small dams and water troughs, providing a convenient and inexhaustible supply of fresh water. The soldier settlers, in their desperate attempt to carve out a living from the wilderness, had unwittingly created the world's largest and most inviting emu health spa and resort. An immense feathered horde, a population estimated by ornithologists to be at least 20,000 strong, descended upon the wheat belt districts, particularly around the remote settlements of Campion and Walgulan. For the emus it was a time of unprecedented bounty. For the farmers it was a biblical plague. The destruction wrought by the emu army was catastrophic. They did not just politely nibble at the heads of the wheat. A single emu could consume a significant amount, but the real damage came from their sheer clumsiness. With their large, splayed feet, they would trample and flatten huge swathes of the crop simply by walking through it. A flock of a few hundred could lay waste to an entire field in a single night. Worse still, in their eagerness to get to the delicious crops, the large birds would charge headlong into the farmers' fences. These were not the robust, multi-stranded steel fences of modern agriculture. They were often flimsy, rudimentary barriers, barely sufficient to keep out rabbits. The emus would smash through them, creating large gaps. These newly opened breaches in the farmers' defenses then acted as a gateway for a secondary invasion force. Hordes of rabbits, another introduced pest, which would pour into the fields and inflict their own devastating damage. The farmers were at their wits' end. They were fighting a war on two fronts, one against the global economic forces of the Depression, and another against the relentless feathered invaders in their own backyards. They tried to fight back. They grabbed their old .303 rifles, the very same weapons they had used in the Great War, and attempted to shoot the birds. But it was a frustratingly futile endeavor. The emus were too numerous. As soon as one flock was scared off from a field, another would appear on the opposite side. They were also surprisingly resilient. Their shaggy coat of feathers seemed to absorb the impact of the bullets, and their large bodies meant that a shot had to be perfectly placed to be fatal. A farmer could hit an emu, only to watch it run off, seemingly uninjured, over the horizon. These were men pushed to the breaking point. They were facing total financial ruin. The crops being devoured before their eyes were not just a commodity. They were their only hope of feeding their families and holding on to their land. Desperate times called for desperate measures. A delegation of these soldier settlers, men accustomed to thinking in military terms, was formed. They traveled to the state capital, Perth, to plead their case with the government. They did not ask for a bailout, nor for subsidies, nor for debt relief. They asked for what soldiers ask for when faced with an enemy that outnumbers them and cannot be stopped by conventional means. They asked for machine guns. Part 3. The Call to Arms. A nation mobilizes against birds. The farmers' extraordinary request made its way through the bureaucratic channels of the Western Australian government and eventually landed on the desk of the Federal Minister for Defence, a man named Sir George Pearce. Sir George was a formidable and long-serving figure in Australian politics. A former carpenter from South Australia, he was one of the founding fathers of the Australian Labor Party, though he had later split with the party over the issue of conscription during the war. By 1932, he was a senior minister in the Conservative United Australia Party government. He was a serious, pragmatic politician, not a man given to whimsical flights of fancy. The idea of deploying the Australian military against a flock of birds must have struck him as utterly ridiculous. However, the political context was complex. The request came not from just any group of farmers. It came from a delegation of decorated war veterans. These were men to whom the nation owed a profound debt. To ignore their plea would be politically disastrous. The government was already under fire for its handling of the Depression, and being seen to abandon the very heroes it had promised to support was not an option. Furthermore, the farmers weren't asking for a handout. They had made a specific offer. They would cover the costs of food, accommodation, and, crucially, all the ammunition used. The government would only need to supply the men and the guns. Sir George Pierce, a canny political operator, saw several potential advantages in this bizarre proposal. Firstly, it was a public relations masterstroke. It would show the government as being proactive, decisive, and responsive to the needs of its struggling veterans and farmers. It was a tangible, visible action. Secondly, it could be spun as a valuable training exercise. The Lewis machine gun, a workhorse of the First World War, was still a key part of the Australian Army's arsenal. An operation like this would provide a unique opportunity for live-fire practice and for soldiers to test the weapon's effectiveness under field conditions. Thirdly, there was a commercial and propaganda angle. The Australian branch of the Fox Movietone newsreel company had gotten wind of the proposal and was enthusiastic about filming the war. They promised to produce stirring patriotic footage of the Australian Army bravely defending the nation's heartland. The potential upside seemed to outweigh the risk of ridicule. After consulting with his military advisors, Sir George Pierce gave his approval. The Commonwealth of Australia was officially going to war. Operation Emu was a go. The military force assembled for this unique campaign was, by any conventional measure, laughably small, a testament to the fact that no one anticipated a serious challenge. The command of the expedition was given to Major G.P.W. Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery. Major Meredith was a career soldier, a man who had seen action in the Great War. He was by all accounts a serious, no-nonsense officer, who approached this unusual assignment with the solemn gravity of a real military campaign. He was not a man who took his duties lightly, even when those duties involved avian adversaries. Accompanying Major Meredith were two other soldiers, Sergeant S. McMurray and Gunner J. O'Halloran. These two men would be responsible for operating and maintaining the expedition's primary armament. Their arsenal consisted of 2 Lewis automatic machine guns and a staggering 10,000 rounds of .303 ammunition. The Lewis gun was a formidable weapon. First introduced in 1914, it was a light machine gun, recognizable by its distinctive wide, circular pan magazine on top and the large barrel shroud. It was capable of firing over 500 rounds per minute and had been a brutally effective weapon in the static trench warfare of World War I. Against unprotected infantry in the open, it was a weapon of slaughter. Against a flock of birds, its effectiveness was about to be tested. In late October of 1932, Major Meredith and his small contingent, along with the Fox Movietone newsreel crew, departed from Perth and headed east, towards the designated theater of war in the Campion district. The soldiers were confident. The farmers were hopeful. The newsreel crew was ready to capture the heroic victory. They were trained soldiers with modern rapid-fire weapons. Their enemy was a collection of large, flightless birds. How hard could it possibly be? This would all be over in a matter of days. The emus, they believed, were about to receive a very sharp, very loud lesson in modern warfare. Part 4: The First Offensive, a Lesson in Guerrilla Warfare. On the 2nd of November 1932, the Great Emu War officially began. Major Meredith, having established a base of operations in the small farming community of Campion, was ready to engage the enemy. Local farmers, acting as scouts, reported a flock of approximately 50 emus in a nearby field. This was the moment. The first battle was at hand. The soldiers, accompanied by a group of local farmers, moved into position. The plan was a classic military envelopment, a simple ambush. The Lewis gun was set up on its tripod, its barrel aimed at a pre-designated kill zone. The farmers on foot and horseback would act as beaters. They would move in a wide arc, flushing the birds out and herding the flock into a single concentrated group, driving them directly into the machine gun's field of fire. On paper, it was a sound, logical plan. The beaters began their advance. The emus grazing peacefully looked up, but they did not react as expected. They did not panic and stampede as a single terrified herd. Instead, they demonstrated a tactical discipline that would come to define the entire conflict. The moment they sensed danger, the large flock instantly fractured. They broke up into numerous small independent units and scattered in every direction, running at full speed in their signature, unpredictable zigzagging pattern. Major Meredith gave the order to fire. The distinctive rat-a-tat-tat of the Lewis gun shattered the outback silence. But the gunner was faced with an impossible task. He was trying to hit a multitude of small, fast-moving, erratic targets. It was like trying to shoot a swarm of gnats with a rifle. He would draw a bead on one bird, only for it to swerve violently, the bullets kicking up plumes of red dust far behind it. The gun traversed back and forth, spitting out rounds, but the birds were simply too fast and too dispersed. After a significant number of rounds had been expended, the engagement was over. The surviving emus had vanished over the horizon. Meredith and his men surveyed the battlefield. The result was deeply underwhelming. A very small number of emus had been killed. One report from a farmer suggested only 2 birds were down. The first battle of the war had been an unmitigated failure, a decisive victory for the emus. Major Meredith, a man accustomed to the more predictable behavior of human soldiers, was stunned. In his official report back to headquarters, he wrote with a newfound respect for his foe, "The emus have proved that they are not so stupid as they are usually considered to be." Undeterred, Meredith reevaluated his strategy. He needed a bigger target. A few days later, his scouts brought him good news. A much larger concentration of the enemy, a flock numbering over 1,000 strong, had been located near a local dam. This was their chance for a decisive action, a true massacre that would break the back of the emu resistance. A new ambush was meticulously planned. This time there would be no beaters to alert the birds. The soldiers would conceal themselves and their Lewis guns in the scrub near the water source and simply wait. The emus would have to come to drink. When they did, they would be at close range, concentrated and vulnerable. The soldiers lay in wait under the hot Australian sun. The hours ticked by. Finally, their patience was rewarded. The enormous flock began to make its way towards the dam. They moved cautiously, but their thirst drew them onwards. Closer and closer they came, walking right into the perfectly prepared kill zone. The tension was palpable. At the opportune moment, Meredith gave the signal. Fire! One of the Lewis guns roared to life. And then, after firing just a dozen rounds, it fell silent. The gun had jammed. A frantic Sergeant McMurray struggled to clear the stoppage. Before the second gun could be brought to bear and a sustained rate of fire established, the emus, alerted by the initial burst of sound, exploded into action. The scene from the first engagement was repeated, but on a massive scale. 1,000 birds scattered in 1,000 different directions. A feathered tidal wave of chaos. By the time the first gun was cleared and the soldiers could resume firing, the golden opportunity had vanished. When the dust settled and the silence returned, the soldiers counted the dead. The result was a bitter disappointment. Approximately 12 birds lay dead on the field. They had ambushed 1,000 emus at point-blank range and killed 12. Major Meredith's frustration was mounting. This was not warfare as he knew it. He was beginning to realize he was not fighting a disorganized rabble. He was fighting a highly effective, decentralized guerrilla army. It was at this point that Meredith developed a deep, grudging admiration for the emu's military capabilities. In his official reports, which read with the surreal gravity of a dispatch from the Western Front, he praised his enemy's tactics. It seems that each mob has its leader, he wrote. A big black-plumed bird which stands fully 6 feet high and keeps watch while his mates carry out their work of destruction and warns them of our approach. He noted their incredible resilience, comparing them to tanks. If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, he famously wrote, it would face any army in the world. The major realized he needed to counter the emu's key strategic advantage, speed. He needed mobility. This led to the third, and perhaps most infamously comical, phase of the first offensive. Meredith ordered one of the Lewis guns to be mounted on the back of a civilian farm truck. The plan was simple. They would use the truck to chase down the flocks of emus across the open plains, firing the machine gun from the moving platform. What ensued was a scene of pure, unadulterated slapstick. The truck bounced and jolted violently as it sped across the rough, uneven farmland. In the back, Gunner O'Halloran, clinging on for dear life, found it absolutely impossible to aim the weapon. The heavy Lewis gun bucked and swayed, sending bursts of fire wildly into the air and the ground. The emus, running at full speed, were more than a match for the clumsy vehicle. They would swerve and zigzag, easily outpacing the truck and its flailing gunner. The chase was not only completely ineffective, not a single bird was hit during these mobile engagements. It was also hazardous to the soldiers and their equipment. At one point, the truck, in hot pursuit of a flock, failed to spot a farm fence in time and crashed directly through it, coming to an abrupt and ignominious halt. The Emu Army had defeated the Australian Army's attempt at mechanized warfare. By now, the story of the Emu War had escaped the confines of the Western Australian wheat belt. The national and international press had seized upon it with glee. The story was simply too good, too strange, too funny to ignore. Headlines in Australia and Britain openly mocked the campaign. A British journalist drily observed that the emus appeared to be employing sophisticated guerrilla tactics. An opposition politician in the Australian Federal Parliament rose to his feet and sarcastically asked the Minister for Defence if a campaign medal was to be designed for this war. Another suggested, to roars of laughter, that perhaps the emu should be offered the use of the second machine gun to make it a fair fight. The ornithologist Dr. Dominic Cervanti commented that the military's attempts were laughable, saying, "The machine gunner's dreams of point-blank fire into serried masses of emus were soon dissipated. The Emu Command had evidently ordered guerrilla tactics, and its unwieldy army soon split up into innumerable small units that made use of the military equipment uneconomic." The campaign was rapidly descending from a well-intentioned, if ill-conceived, relief effort into a full-blown national embarrassment. It was also proving to be incredibly wasteful. By the 8th of November, after almost a week of active operations, Major Meredith's force had expended 2,500 rounds of ammunition. His own official, and likely generous, estimate of enemy casualties was around 50 birds. Some press reports claimed the number was as low as 20. This represented a staggering expenditure of between 50 and 125 bullets for every confirmed kill. Back in the capital city of Canberra, Sir George Pearce was facing a political firestorm. He was being ridiculed in Parliament, savaged in the press, and was receiving letters from a nascent conservationist movement, horrified at the spectacle of the Australian Army gunning down the bird that proudly stood on the nation's coat of arms. The absurdity of the situation had become untenable. On November 8, the order was given. Major Meredith and his men were to cease operations and withdraw from the field. The first phase of the Great Emu War was over. The emus had won. It was not a partial victory. It was not a stalemate. It was a complete and utter rout. Major Meredith, upon his withdrawal, was candid in his assessment. He reported that his unit had suffered no casualties, but he was unequivocal about the outcome. "The emus," he told the press, "have won." Part 5. The Second Offensive and the Bitter Aftermath. One might assume that this humiliating defeat would have marked the end of Australia's military ambitions against its avian population. A strange, embarrassing chapter to be quietly closed and forgotten. But the fundamental problem that had started the war had not been solved. In fact, it was getting worse. As soon as Major Meredith's small force packed up their guns and departed, the emus, seemingly emboldened by their victory, resumed their destructive feasting on the wheat fields. The weather grew hotter and drier, pushing even more birds from the arid interior towards the tempting irrigated farmlands. The farmers who had briefly dared to hope were now more desperate than ever. They bombarded their local representatives with telegrams and letters, claiming the emus were more cunning and destructive than ever before, and that their attacks were intensifying. The Premier of Western Australia, James Mitchell, lent his powerful voice to their cause, lobbying the federal government relentlessly for a renewal of military assistance. Sir George Pearce was caught in a political vice. On one hand, he was acutely aware of the public ridicule that a second campaign would invite. On the other, the pressure from the Western Australian government and the powerful veterans' lobby was immense. These were his political constituents and their livelihoods were at stake. Reluctantly, and against his better political judgment, he authorized a second offensive. On the 13th of November 1932, a mere 5 days after being recalled in defeat, Major Meredith was once again dispatched to the front lines. The war was back on. This second campaign was conducted with a grim, newfound determination. The element of surprise was gone, as was the naive optimism of the first attempt. Meredith and his men had learned from their failures. They abandoned the disastrous mobile tactics. They focused on careful, patient ambushes, often in more broken, wooded country where the emu's speed advantage was somewhat negated. Their gunnery, honed by their previous encounters, was more accurate. In terms of pure statistics, this second round was far more successful. Over the next month, from mid-November to early December, Meredith's force was able to inflict significant casualties on the emu population. The official figures from this second campaign state that 986 emus were killed with the expenditure of 9,860 rounds of ammunition. This represents a vastly improved, though still somewhat startling, kill rate of exactly 10 bullets per bird. A further 2,500 birds, it was reported, were wounded and later died from their injuries, though this figure is impossible to verify. But even Meredith, in his final report, acknowledged that these numbers did not represent a strategic victory. The emu population of Western Australia was simply too vast and too resilient. His small force could achieve temporary local success, clearing the birds from one farm or one district for a short time. But as soon as they moved on, new flocks of emus would simply migrate in to take their place. He was winning isolated skirmishes, but he had no hope of winning the wider war. He was trying to empty the ocean with the bucket. On the 10th of December, the military campaign was officially and finally called off. The Great Emu War was over. The soldiers packed their Lewis guns and went home for good. The final verdict was clear. The emus had successfully defended their territory. The Australian army had been fought to a standstill and had withdrawn from the field. So what finally brought an end to the emu plague? It was not the army. The solution, when it came, was far more practical and far less dramatic. Came in two parts. Firstly, the government, having learned that military intervention was a costly and embarrassing failure, instituted a bounty system. This had been suggested before the war but had been dismissed. Now it was embraced. The government offered a small monetary payment for every emu beak that was handed in. This simple economic incentive proved to be far more effective than machine guns. It mobilized a much larger force: the farmers themselves, their families, and professional roo shooters and hunters, who culled the birds systematically over a much wider area and a much longer period. This sustained, decentralized pressure was something the emu population could not withstand as easily as a short, localized military campaign. The numbers tell the story. In a single 6-month period in 1934, bounties were claimed for 57,034 emus. Secondly, and most importantly, the ultimate solution was one of engineering, not ballistics. Over the following years, the government provided subsidies and assistance for the construction of proper exclusion fencing. Stronger, higher, and more robust fences, specifically designed to keep emus out, began to crisscross the wheat belt. It was an agricultural problem, and ultimately it required an agricultural solution. Fences, it turned out, were a far more effective weapon than machine guns. Part 6. The Echo of a Feathered War Legacy and Meaning. So why, decades later, do we still tell this story? Why has the Great Emu War, a minor and deeply strange episode in Australian history, become such an enduring and beloved piece of historical lore? A staple of weird history podcasts and internet articles around the world. I believe it is because the story resonates on so many different levels. On its most accessible level, it is a masterclass in historical comedy. It is a tale of military folly, a perfect and hilarious illustration of human hubris. We, with our advanced technology, our military doctrines, and our supreme confidence, declared war on an enemy we completely misunderstood, and we were soundly and publicly defeated. It's a classic David and Goliath story, but one where Goliath shows up with a machine gun and David is a flock of large, goofy-looking, and surprisingly intelligent birds. The image of soldiers in a truck, bouncing through the outback trying to gun down zigzagging emus, is a scene of pure, unadulterated slapstick, made all the funnier by the fact that it actually happened. But if we look beneath the comedy, there is a far more poignant and human story. This was not a war conceived in arrogance, but in desperation. The soldier settlers who begged for machine guns were not foolish men. They were heroes of the nation, men who had endured the unimaginable, who were now watching their families starve and their life's work be destroyed. Their call for military intervention was a primal scream of despair from people who had been pushed to the absolute brink. The Great Emu War is a powerful, if strange, lens through which to view the very real human suffering of the Great Depression. It is also a fascinating case study in unconventional warfare. Major Meredith's official reports are remarkable documents. In them, we see a conventional military mind struggling to comprehend and categorize an unconventional foe. His attempts to frame the emu's behavior in military terms, identifying leaders, praising their discipline, and decrying their use of guerrilla tactics, are both comical and revealing. He was trying to fit a natural phenomenon into the only intellectual framework he possessed, the framework of war. He learned a hard lesson that many have had to learn since. You cannot defeat a migration with bullets. You cannot bomb a force of nature into submission. The legacy of the Great Emu War in Australia is a strange and gentle one. It is a source of national amusement, a story told with a wry, self-deprecating humor. It is a feathered monument to the idea that the most complex, technologically advanced solution is not always the best one. It is a humbling reminder that nature is resilient, adaptive, and will always be unpredictable. And so our long, strange story comes to a close. The soldiers returned to their barracks. The farmers eventually got their fences and a measure of security. Sir George Pearce went on to a long and distinguished political career, though he was never quite able to shake the faint, feathered shadow of his most famous military campaign. And the emus, well, the emus are still there. They still stride across the vast plains of Australia, a living, breathing, flightless testament to their improbable victory in the strangest war the world has ever, and will likely ever see. What do you make of this bizarre chapter in history? Is the Great Emu War just a funny anecdote, a historical curiosity? Or does it hold a deeper meaning about our place in the world, about the limits of our power, and about our relationship with the natural world we so often seek to control? I would be genuinely interested to hear your own thoughts and interpretations in the comments below. The joy of exploring these forgotten corners of history lies not just in the telling, but in the conversation that follows. If you have enjoyed this exhaustive dive into one of history's most peculiar military failures, please consider subscribing to our channel. There are so many more stories, from the grand to the bizarre, from the tragic to the hilarious, waiting to be unearthed from the archives of the past. Thank you for your time, and for joining me on this journey into the Australian outback of 1932. And as you go about your day, perhaps you will spare a thought for the humble emu, a creature that stood its ground, faced the armed forces of a continent, and against all conceivable odds won.